the pleasure of talking to Paul Laverty, who's the screenwriter of Sorry We Missed You, which is Ken Loach's most recent film.
You name it, I've done it. Concreting, plumbing.
Is that you too?
I've done it all.
It's a really excellent film. It's basically centred on a man who works in the gig economy. He works as a delivery driver, and it kind of follows the strains that puts on his family life, along with his carer wife, played, I think the character's name is Debbie, who's on a 0 hours contract. So it basically goes into a very well-told story about the strain that puts on their family life and just being able to live. So fortunately, I got a chance to talk to Paul Laverty before he did a Q&A at the Cameo earlier this month. So we'll go straight into the interview, and basically I started off by asking him why they chose to focus on that particular aspect of the gig economy, because there's various different ways it could be represented, and then we got into what they were trying to achieve with the film, the response, and how they went about making it. There's many aspects of the gig economy you could have focused on, because obviously it has so many different facets and so many different ways that people are engaging with it. What was it that made you focus upon delivery drivers of the sort of Amazon DPD nature in particular? Was it just the research, or was there something about that particular thing that...
No, it's a good question, and yeah, there are many options, but the drivers and the couriers gives us a lot of levels, always like that. You know, first of all, you've got the extreme control with the scanner or the gun that they call it, you know, so it measures everything. We now see the death of the high street. We see more and more shops going bust. We see city centres dying. There's the whole environmental question now as well. Is that a good model really for one exploited driver, you know, running around and delivering shoes and socks and curries and vapes and some of the crazy things I heard that were delivered? You know, meanwhile the drivers are massively exploited, and then there's pollution all over the place. They zigzag out of order because they must meet precisers. It ties in with extreme demand from consumers, and of course it ties in with these great monstrous companies, you know, like Jeff Bezos and Amazon. And so if you do this, I mean, there's lots of levels to it. And then if you mix that with someone who's a carer and 0 hour contracts looking after our older people, there's a demographic time bomb. And how are we looking after our old people? And so we just thought, well, let's have a look at precarious work and make a very intimate portrait of a family and see how much time these adults actually spend with their children. And of course it begs a great big existential question about how much time do you spend with your children? What is the point of work if you can't look after your children properly? So there was kind of great richness in it, and I suppose that's what attracted us to it.
So, on a similar sort of theme, so obviously Daniel Blake dealt with the welfare state, or at least certainly the way this government has been treating it, their attitude to it, and the effect that has on actual people. What made you want to stay in that area? Because obviously this is a different thing, but it is related, and obviously the Abby character, her arc is kind of intrinsically linked to cuts and how we deal with kind of looking after society. What made you want to remain within that area?
Yeah, I suppose we kind of imagine that the Turner family, this is, you know, in the Turner family we deal with, probably lived, you know, a few streets down the road from Daniel Blake. So we see it as a companion piece. But they're very different worlds. Daniel Blake was about the world of welfare, about an older man. He was quite isolated in some senses. Yes, we imagined this was a family that, you know, just really lived a couple of doors along the street from Daniel Blake. So it was a companion piece. And one is the world of welfare and how strict and vicious that can be. We see people who are in their last months of life are deemed to be fit for work. We came across that barbarity and systematic cruelty by the state. But in a strange way, I think you need a kind of a barbaric system in welfare if you're going to try and keep people in these terrible precarious jobs who are pushed to the limit. So there is a kind of a connection between them, and there is a method in their madness. And we also just wanted to look at a young family. The world of work. The world of work dictates so much about our lives and the quality of our lives and how much time we spend. And another thing, of course, when we actually did the research for Daniel Blake, we went to food banks up and down the country, and we heard so many stories from people, and you look them in the eye, You try to understand the intricacies and the detail of their life. And what struck us was there were so many people who were working in precarious work. So they had jobs. So it was the working poor. It wasn't just people who were unemployed or couldn't work. And so that really made us question, how is it? What's happening to work? The precarious nature of it, agency work, 0-hour contracts, gig economy. There's so many people had to go to a food bank to feed their children. I mean, that is a real massive seismic shift under the surface. So we really wanted to examine all of that.
One thing I wanted to ask you about in that respect was also the character of Maloney, so the warehouse boss. And obviously, it would be very easy to fall into something very caricatured there. But I found that certainly wasn't the case. In particular, there's that point where he gets the chance to explain his rationale.
Yes. And
it's, to my mind, flawed rationale, but you can at least see it's more the system rewards that.
Yes, and I think that's a very good question. I'm glad you've raised it, because I didn't want to see him to be the central casting bad guy at all. In fact, I remember when we were speaking to Ross, we were saying, I mean, this man is actually, you know, he feels he has to be cruel to be kind. He says he wants to form a protective cover over his depot so that they win the contracts and thereby look after the families he's responsible for. And so he's brutal. He calls himself, well, I better not say the words in case it cuts you out from community radio, but he calls himself, you know, he has a certain description of himself, and he kind of revels in that. But I mean, it's not him, it's the bad guy, it's the system. He is in that position because he fulfills a role, and he has just been carrying out the logic of that role. They must keep the scanner happy, because the scanner must be satisfied, and if that hits its targets, they win more contracts from Zara and John Lewis and Amazon and wherever. So for him, it's actually in the logic of capital that he must do that. So he's not the bad guy. He's just. But yeah, you need characters like that to carry it out, you know.
On that note, in terms of, because I'll say it would have been easy to make him a caricature, but he's not. I know from your previous statements on this, you do a lot of research into understanding the characters and kind of the stories that need to be told here. What is it you hope the reaction is? Because obviously there's a certain level of predictable reaction from people who are predisposed otherwise, shall we say. But from a social perspective, what is it you hope the response is?
Well, we had the usual hysterical reaction from conservatives and conservative supporters, and as we did with I, Daniel Blake, they said it was exaggerated, but then they were hit with tons of tweets and information that overwhelmed them, and they realised that we'd only scratched the surface. And some of them have started on the same thing now with the couriers. And for those people who accuse us of exaggerating, I like to tell people the story of Don Lane, who was a driver with DPD. He was a man who had diabetes. He was 52 years of age. I met his wife after the screening, actually. I didn't meet her till after the film was made. But Don, he got fined £150 per day when he couldn't find a replacement driver when he had important specialist appointments. And anyway, so he missed a few of those, and then he had more specialist appointments, but he couldn't afford to get the fines. He was scared of getting into debt. He was under great stress, couldn't find replacement drivers, which sounds easy, but because they're now deemed to be self-employed, they carry the responsibility of that. If you were ill before, you would just get sick pay. Anyway, to cut a very long story short, he became more and more ill. One of his fellow workers said, "Don, you're breaking up. You're falling apart." His wife was very worried about him. Then it was over a Christmas period. They had lots of deliveries to do. On the 4th of January, I think it was 2018. I think that was the year he died. 2018, he died of complications. This is a 52-year-old man who should still be with us today, should still be with his lovely wife, Ruth. And he was trapped inside a logic like that. DPD have since banned that £150 fine. But a lot of these companies now, they just change the language. They say 3 strikes and they're out, and they find a different way to do it. But the point is, all risk with these self-employed contracts, they're bogus self-employed contracts. They don't call them workers, they call them owner-driver franchisees. They don't get hired, they become on board. You don't get paid a salary, you paid a fee. So they've got all this language, and they create this language so that you, the driver, which every single moment of your life is controlled by this scanner because it knows where you are, what position you're in, where you put the parcels, the moment you clock on to the moment you clock off. You're deemed to be a free entrepreneur who decides his own fate. And it's absolute bollocks. So I think what you see now is how technology is used not to liberate but to enslave people. And then you see Abby on the other side with her 0-hour contracts. Her working day is spread out from first thing in the morning to late at night. She gets people up in the morning, gives them breakfast. There's the meds at lunchtime and meals, and at night time the tuck-ins. And then there's all these spaces during the day where she doesn't get paid. She has to pay her own travelling expenses. Oftentimes when you measure all that out, it's less than the minimum wage. So again, it suits the employer because they don't pay them when it doesn't suit them to work. But once again, you see families, family life, the rhythm of family work totally destroyed. So when I hope people see this, they'll say, well, it suits the market, it suits the shareholders, it suits the big giant corporations, but it doesn't suit us, it doesn't suit the community, it doesn't suit children, it doesn't suit the schools when the children are tired and they don't have the supervision of their parents, they're not having their homework, there's no family cohesion. There's a kind of a madness in it. So I hope people get really, really mad and say, well, this is why Jeff Bezos has got 150 billion. Why all these tech companies, tell us there's no alternative. And what they do is they squeeze more and more profit and crush people. That's what they're doing. They're crushing people. And they're using technology to do it. Those people are manacled to these, just as surely as a slave was to the irons way, way, way back. And the wonderful English poet from 200 years ago, William Blake, talked about mind-forged manacles. In other words, how we enslave our own brains. And I think that's what's happened with these bogus self-employed contracts. You're an entrepreneur. It's your business. So if you're not a millionaire and have your own franchisee in 5 years, you're a failure. You're morally weak. You haven't got enough intelligence. You're not creative enough. You're not working hard enough. So once again, the blame falls on the person. So it suits the market, but it doesn't suit us. We're not just consumers. We're workers. We're neighbours. We're community members. We're part of something. And what we're doing is we're destroying the fabric of the most intimate space that we have, which is our lives. All that new language. And of course, they've got teams of psychologists and lawyers and PR. The people who design these onboarding, all this language, and it's absolute, let's call it for what it is. It's absolute total bullshit. And the people who live through it, they know they're trapped in it when they're in it. Now, what they'll do is they'll present workers who get a few hours work, retired people who do a couple of hours here and there when it suits them, and that's okay. But for people who have got families or people who have got to earn their monthly income, all power is with the corporation. 0-hour contract. You're hired when the corporation wants you. You can't say, no, I'm not working today. You're at their beck and call. Oftentimes you can't work for other people. So all the power is with the corporation, but they use the language of freedom and choice, which is an absolute farce.
One thing I wanted to ask you about was, obviously, in your case, you've done quite a lot of work on social causes from a more direct involvement. Obviously, in terms of you've done humanitarian work, you used to work as a human rights lawyer. What is it about the creative process, and screenwriting in particular? What is the power there that you think you find? Because clearly there's something there that speaks to your ideas about being able to instigate something or communicate something. What is it that you find is different compared to the way you've engaged with these issues in your earlier life?
Well, I suppose Ken and myself, we've worked together now for over 25 years. We've done a whole number of films together. I can't remember now, is it 14 features and several shorts? And I suppose you're motivated by what's going on around you, trying to understand the world, trying to figure out how power works in our lives. But what we want to do is tell great stories. We don't want to have this. They're not manifestos. They're not kind of two-dimensional pamphlets, I hope. You have to just find rich stories. So when people see Sorry We Miss You, I hope they'll see an intimate of a modern family, all the intricacies and subtleties and the nuances of different relationships, daughter to father, partners between them, sibling relationships, and and mother to son. And it's endlessly complex and fascinating, and I hope people will recognise, some of their friends or neighbours or some of themselves in it. So I suppose we try to tell stories so that will resonate, and hopefully people will come up with a few questions. But films themselves don't change anything, but they can add to the conversation. With Daniel Blake, I think it helped undermine the stereotype of people on welfare and the grand lies propagated by the state. And I hope, we'll do the same thing here, but what I think, to change anything is going to take radical political action. And I noticed there, I'm not a member of the Labour Party, but I did notice that John MacDonald in his last party conference speech down in Brighton just a couple of weeks ago, he said the first thing they would do is they would get rid of 0-hour contracts. Every worker would have trade union rights from the first day they started. Everybody will get the living wage, and they will outlaw subcontracting for carers. Now, if they did that, it's not a revolution, Jim, but what it would be a remarkable turnabout in the lives of millions of workers. And what we've noticed too is that this isn't just about the UK. We've just come back from Ireland and Italy and France, where we showed the film to 1,100 workers. It's the same story there, precarious work, chambermaids, cleaners, courier drivers. I just got a letter today from someone in Brazil. I got another letter today from our Japanese distributor to see how it's resonating there. So all this use of technology, precarious work, and people not getting to the end of the month is now becoming absolutely universal with this system. So I think it begs the big question, how we begin to recognise that the market, the so-called free market, is a nonsense, and we have to plan work and plan our lives in a way that's more sustainable and more humane.
So one other thing I want to ask you about was the setting of Newcastle, because obviously that's been maintained between Daniel Blake and what is it? I've heard both you and Ken Loach speak very favourably about the likes of Glasgow, Liverpool and other cities in the UK. What is it about Newcastle that made you want to keep the setting for the story there?
Well, there are artistic reasons and there's practical reasons. Because everybody in Daniel Blake, all the small parts, that turns into the whole. And the city gave us great life. There's great personalities there. The accent's vital. The people are fun. There's a bounce to them. And some cities just have a spark about them. I think Glasgow has it. I think Liverpool has it. And Newcastle definitely has it. Maybe it's something to do with its working class history or not. But there's a mix there. And there's also great variety. I mean, the Victorian city centre is absolutely stunning in Newcastle, and then it's got all sorts of varieties, and and the great thing about it is you can get around it quickly as well. You're not stuck in traffic for 2 hours trying to get to a location. And also there was great support from the city. You really felt there was a buoyancy there and well received. People made it easy for us, and there was a kind of a generosity of spirit. So we just thought, this is a companion piece to Daniel Blake and it'll work very well here.
With that in mind, in your script, when you conceived the characters, was Ricky always going to be Mancunian, or is that something that came from the casting of Chris?
Well, I mean, what we do, the casting is a long process, and we've got a brilliant casting director called Colleen Crawford, who's worked with us for a long time. And what Ken always says is, we try to find the best person who gives flesh and blood to the character as imagined in the script. So we saw people all over. We saw a brilliant Glaswegian who was terrific, and we saw lots of good people, but we didn't want it just to be based in Newcastle. And Chris, we just felt was very close to the character as we imagined. I mean, he'd done some acting beforehand, but he'd run his own business. He was a plumber. He had his own van. He knew that world, and I think he just believed him as a courier driver. Debbie, who was absolutely quite brilliant, she'd done a few scenes as extras, but she was a teaching assistant, and she just had a quality about her that we just imagined that was very, very close to Abby in the film. And then the 2 kids were local kids who were just terrific. So we just tried to create a believable family. But I think Ken always makes brave choices. We sit down and we do it together with Rebecca, and we try and just decide who fits best. But he always makes brave choices. and I think they did a really original job in this, because I think you actually really do believe it's a family.
On a kind of a similar note with all of that, so I was fortunate enough to speak to Ken several years ago, just after The Angel's Share came out, and he spoke about the perception of your films, so your collaborations with him, as being political, or from his view, not being political. Is that something you share, in the sense that you don't conceive them as stories that are meant to make a political point, but it's more in telling the stories of actual people, it comes to make a point that you feel is valuable?
Well, making a point makes it sound like a manifesto, and we try and avoid that. What we want to do is have rounded characters and a rich story that acts on many different levels, and if you do that well, I think the politics flows from it naturally, but it's not forced out of it. When you watch The Bicycle Thieves, that beautiful neorealist film from Rome after the war, it's a simple story about a man trying to get a bike, but what you do is you just see the devastation and the unemployment and the hunger and the precariousness of their whole lives just through a simple tale. Now, it's massively political. And then, of course, there are other films that are massively political, especially the big, huge American budgets, which are often very, very right-wing. Massively political, in my opinion, but they're deemed to be entertainment. So how a film is called political or non-political, or called, kitchen sink drama, or, gritty socialist realism, I don't really go for any of these great. I think it just distracts from what's in front of your eye. I just think people should try and just try and engage with the story and have an open mind about it. I think that's what we try and achieve.
In that mind, some of the slightly more hysterical reactions to, in particular, Daniel Blake, but I'm sure this one's going to get them as well. Unfortunately,
that doesn't bother us.
Is there something about the fact that you're telling a fictional story that you've come up with now, albeit it's based in research and it's based in real people, which makes it indisputable, in the sense that because of this kind of like post-truth era we seem to be living in, people will question anything, but because you have ownership of this story and it's conveying, I like to think, a greater truth beyond the specifics of a specific situation. Is there something about that can't be refuted, whereas something in a documentary or some sort of statistic that's been interpreted a certain way could be now?
Well, it's what we try and do. This is a totally fictional story, but it's after Ken and myself have absorbed and done a lot of really digging. Especially when that's my job to do that digging, really, and then share it with Ken. And that's very, very important for us. Now, for Daniel Blake, it's really hard to get your head around the welfare legislation. And once you can get your head around the law, then you have to get your head around how it's lived in practice, the lived experience of it. And you can only do that by spending time with people and really being rigorous. And so after doing all that, then what you do is try and forget it, because there's so many hundreds of options. You can't copy a screenplay from the street. You can't copy a screenplay from the research. Now you have to forget it, and then it's the imaginative leap to invent the characters and pick the premise and try and choose the right people and then sort out the narrative. Now that's the really complicated, difficult bit. Now it's fictional, but if we hadn't done that well, and if we had lied about what those characters did in I, Daniel Blake, it'd have undermined the whole project, and the Tories would have screwed us. But they couldn't do that. They never found that gap. They tried to say we were exaggerating, and every time they did, people came back and said, well, that's nonsense, and here's the A, B, C, and D of it. So eventually, I think it was mentioned about 8 times in Parliament, I think they started trying to ignore it. But that was very important, that it was resilient. And really, really important for me and Ken that it stands up. Otherwise, they'll use any little mistake that we might have made to try and drag down the whole piece. And I'm sure they'll try and do the same thing here. But But we're not really worried about that. We welcome the debate.
It's a wonderful film. Thank you for speaking to me. I hope it does extremely well, especially in its forthcoming run at the Film House. Paul Laverty, thank you for speaking to me.
A great pleasure, Jim, and thanks for your interest and your really sharp questions. Really enjoyed this conversation with you.
Thank you.